Okay.
Meeting of the Standing Zoning Review Committee. It's called to order. Today we're gathered to get a presentation from Dutchess County Planning regarding the short-term rental situation in legislation. As last month we met with the town board, and they gave us some direction as to what the issues were, that thereby being affordable housing being the main concern, with short-term rentals taking away from affordable housing stock for working people, and in looking at what possible regulation the town would like to put in place in the zoning in order to address that. So Heather and Clayton, and I'm sorry, Gail. Came from Dutchess County Planning to give us to talk to us, not give us supposed to talk to us about short-term rental regulation, to answer our questions, which hopefully will help.
So yeah, I'm going to start by giving kind of an overview. I'm sure everybody knows what short-term rental is. Airbnb is kind of the platform most people are familiar with. But it's the rental of a unit or part of a unit for typically less than 30 or 31 days. And we have some data on short-term rentals in Dutchess County, which I can share with you. I did pull out some numbers. We get information on a quarterly basis through our finance department because the county collects bed tax, hotel occupancy tax from short-term rentals, just like they would from bed and breakfast and hotel. And so we have some aggregate counts for communities. And you can see at the top of the sheet that I handed out, you can see what your quarterly counts were for last year. We rounded out 23 with 31 units out of the county total, which was 1,004. It doesn't sound like much, but I think it's important to put it into context. I had my census person look up the number of housing units in Pine Plain, which was 1175. Dutchess County as a whole is over 122,000 housing units. So the percentage of housing units in Pine Plains that are being used for short-term rental is 2.6%. That's actually more than 3 times higher than the county average percentage. So, as far as do short-term rentals impact your housing availability and affordability? The answer is probably. Are they the only problem? No. We sort of know from the housing needs assessment that we did, countywide housing needs assessment we did back in 22, that we really have a lot of issues that affect housing availability and affordability, and short-term rentals is potentially just one.
Just on your statistics, so I guess I didn't understand. So the county requires short-term rentals to register somehow. How do you know how many there are by blank?
Question, right? So the county for the last few years has been contracting with a web-based service. It was called Post Compliance, and now it's called Granicus. They call it, they scrape the internet. They scrape all these sites, which I think there are like hundreds of sort of Airbnb type sites, right? There's Airbnb, VRBO, Homestay, and a million other ones that I don't even know of. Their computers sort of search those and spit out information about when they find units that are in Dutchess County. So they get that report and then they reach out.
So it's unlikely anybody can hide.
Are some falling through the cracks? Perhaps. The county also has an agreement with Airbnb that Airbnb will collect. I think I'm saying this right. I think Airbnb collects the tax and remits it on behalf of their hosts on a quarterly basis.
And it's a room tax per night?
Be like whatever you would pay at a hotel. Yeah. Okay. It's a hotel occupancy tax.
Yep.
Yep.
Can I ask a question? Does it separate out like a whole house versus a room in a garage?
That's a
barn or a camper or a tent or a.
I don't know if it gets that specific. I don't have that data on a quarterly basis. The only other piece of information it tells me is whether or not it's a single dwelling unit or a multifamily dwelling unit. But in digging through some of my notes, I actually did find that piece of data from several years ago. I had this one point in time piece of data that told me that 87% of the short-term rentals in Dutchess County were for the entire unit. I did reach out, but unfortunately, all of my contacts were like patients, so I did not get an updated number. But I think it's safe to say that the majority of them are not a room in a house or a part of a house being rented. It's probably the entire. And those are the ones that can sometimes tend to impact your housing.
And the counting methodology accounts for all those different platforms, like you're not counting one on VRBO and one on Airbnb and one.
Correct. They actually give me 2 data points for each municipality. They give me the number of units and they give me the number of listings. And the number of listings is always higher because some of them will cross-pollinate on different platforms. Quite frankly, the only time the number of listings comes into play is when you're paying them for their service. They charge you by the number of listings, not the number of units. So functionally, for land use, we care about the number of units, right?
So, I mean, that says to me, it's a pretty damn good count.
Mhm.
Thanks. I just want to, I was just trying to get the basis for the data.
Yep.
I have a question. So when they do this scraping, like Airbnb, a lot of times it doesn't say, are they able to get behind like the addresses of these things? Because like, right, it was normally if you go to Airbnb, it'll say like, this is in the general area of here. Like, how do they know which one is which?
So they have no idea.
So how do they know which the address?
I don't know, but there must be a way
Okay.
because the service can then basically like generate, the outreach to those lodging places and send them. And that's actually something that I can mention now. One of the things the county instituted a few years ago, because one of the things we understand is that trying to figure out the short-term rental puzzle in your community is complicated, and it can be a real burden from sort of an enforcement perspective, like figuring out where they are and all that jazz. So the county has kind of an ongoing offer to communities that if community adopts regulations related to short-term rentals in whatever manner that you write them up, you can reach out to our finance department and the county will actually foot the bill for 2 of the modules. I can't remember what they are. I think it's here. There's an address identification module and a compliance monitoring module through this web service. So that can help your town enforcement officials sort of know where they are and
The county pays for this or?
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
See, I think that was a concern as we talked about, if there was gonna be any regulations, how does a little tiny town with a small budget afford it? With, with one part-time code enforcement officer, that's a significant
Are you the
potential help.
Yes, right. And so that's one of the things that, and there's always a caveat that it's, depends on the sort of annual budget, but it's been trucking along now for several years. And I just asked, and I can't remember how many communities are utilizing that. It's 8 or 10 out of the 30 have reached out and are doing that collaboration and then having the county put that bill. So then if you have, if you end up having an annual permit, and if there's an inspection component or whatever, I'm assuming I don't know how it works. I never used it, but I'm assuming it helps you sort of like know where they are, reach out and communicate to them in whatever way that you need to communicate to them.
And when new ones show up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, this is only our second meeting on this issue that was given to us by the town board, and the first thing we identified was that we don't even have an inventory. We don't know what we're talking about. And you're telling, and it sounds to me like that, based upon what the county's done, we got an inventory.
You can get access to that,
Mhm.
right. Like I don't have anything except a number, I
Yep.
don't know where they are, I couldn't tell you.
Yep.
But I have an aggregate number, I get it on a quarterly basis. I can tell you as far as sort of countywide, what have we been seeing? They've definitely been obviously, we have more now than we had a few years ago. I think the numbers were sort of artificially low during COVID because anecdotally we were hearing though a lot of short-term rentals. People were actually reaching out and saying, "Oh, can I actually just rent this for 6 months?" And that's no longer a short-term rental. So we think the numbers were a little low a couple of years ago. They're sort of, they're rising again. It's just kind of settling back out after COVID.
All right, sorry to get you off your presentation. I
No,
needed to understand the
No,
number.
that's what they want. They don't
We're just
want us asking questions.
Yeah, so we're ask away. I just sort of have like a random list of just things to think about. The effect on housing availability and affordability, again, is it going to solve your issues? No. Is it probably contributing? Yeah, a little bit. And even if the units that are being offered for short-term rental, maybe you might look at those and say, well, those wouldn't be affordable, if that particular unit. True. But every time you take a unit out of the mix for ownership or long-term rent, you're reducing your available housing stock, which then can make it A, harder to find a place to live, and B, it's likely going to cost more because supply and demand dictates that, when there's are less choices out there, the prices tend to go up. So it's not necessarily a one-for-one, it doesn't really matter which places are offered for short-term rental. It's just that they've removed units from the pool.
Yeah, because we probably want to see like a map of where they are, which would help us determine also like, and what the quality or whatever you want to call it, these expensive, the difference between a house off of 83 that's, up on a hill that's, $3 million house that's renting for whatever, a week versus an apartment in the middle of town, which would, is what we're more concerned about, obviously,
Yeah, you just have to remember that, the housing is sort of like, I like actually in the article, it was a joint effort by a few of us, one person who retired, and the other person who's not us anymore. And my colleague Ann Saylor had come up with this comparison of sort of talking about the housing stock as kind of a game of musical chairs, right? You sort of have what you have. You have 1,175 housing units. And even if you've got a $3 million house loan offered for short-term rental, sometimes what will happen is if you have someone at that price point that's looking to actually buy, or I guess they could rent long-term, but they're looking to buy and they look around and there isn't something that's that expensive, they're gonna maybe buy less expensive, and then maybe they'll put something up if they don't find something at their price point. So even if what's being rented is more expensive than what you would consider affordable, just the fact that it's there is still affecting the affordability of other homes and apartments in your community. It's like a little bit of like a game of musical chairs, Something's always going to be left standing.
You suggest that you suspect short-term rentals are impacting the availability of affordable rental housing. Are there things that impact the availability? Other things, like what are some of the big players in that pie chart that make up?
There's all sorts of things, right? Like, these days, what's affecting housing availability and affordability? Interest rates, high interest rates not only are making it harder for people to borrow and to buy, but it's also making some people stay put where they might have moved before. So we don't have as many units on the market now because I don't know about you, but if I bought my house 15 years ago and my interest rate's 3.5%, even if I kind of felt like moving, I'd be like, I'm not moving now. I'm going to keep my 3.5% mortgage, So it can tamp down on supply. Just general costs are up for all sorts of things. There's a lot of different, economic and inequalities, and there are a lot of different factors.
It's too complex because you might move. You got your 3.5% mortgage. You'd say, I'll keep that, do it as a short-term rental, use that income to buy another place.
There you go.
As opposed to putting it on the market.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
It'd be interesting to hear from people in the gallery behind us here about if maybe some of them are people who rent their property short-term, but what that difference is between what they think they're gaining doing it from a short-term rental perspective as they would compared to if they just rented it at market value for 6 months or 12 months out of the year. That's gonna be a huge part of that cohort, I don't know.
Chime in.
I operate in Airbnb,
You're trying
but
to identify.
I operate in Airbnb. I'm a town board member, so I think I need to recuse myself from this discussion.
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Might be right.
Well, she feels she wants right now. Fine.
Paywall experience.
So, I have a little cottage on my property that was my father's for 25 years, and when he passed away, I wanted to keep the cottage so that when my extended family, you know, my kids, my grandkids and stuff come into town, they have a place to stay. And I have lots of, you know, bedrooms for everybody. So I do a short-term rental, and when people are coming, I block it out. Do I make more doing the short term than if I were to rent it on a monthly basis? Absolutely not. Make a lot less. I'm just trying to pay the electric bill. So I know that Dutchess County taxes, it's a 4% tax, and I think that you could identify the addresses because every one of our addresses are taxed. So one of my questions to the county would be, what happens to that tax, and can it somehow be parlayed back to the town of Pine Plains or whatever municipality those Airbnbs, VRBOs or whatever are in? Can the town then benefit some way by that tax?
Is it a sales tax essentially?
No, it's a road tax, you know, essentially.
Yeah, it's like a hotel.
Hotel tax.
And then, so the other issue in my mind is that this is a little cottage that's on my property. I'm present. I know exactly what's going on at all times there. I think that there's a different category of Airbnbs and VRBOs where people come in and buy a bunch of places and, you know, it's an LLC or something, and then it's like a business, and they live in Michigan or something. And maybe they have a house manager that is somewhat effective in overseeing it, and maybe they don't. So in my mind, those are two major differences. And I hope that the town eventually will kind of look at that. So
Does the county's data reflect which LLCs or individuals are paying multiple occupancy taxes? Like, would you know?
I-
Oh,
I just get a number.
I bet they could get that. out.
We don't really know.
yeah,
So
certainly the addresses.
my understanding is that the addresses are not available to public people's privacy keys. Obviously, if you end up paying, you know, getting the service, then you would have them. But it's not something that we'll hand out. So to get back to your first question about the tax money, that's totally above my pay grade. As far as where it goes and who decides, I mean, that's like a county legislature thing,
Yeah.
right? They're the ones that are gonna decide what happens with that.
Can we add our own tax?
I think you actually can. I think you can add your own occupancy tax.
I mean, I'm old enough, been around long enough and worked for the county long enough that I can tell you what their logic was in collecting room tax. It was to take it and supposedly put it in the budget to promote more tourism, to have more people come and stay, because tourism is kind of for the most part, a pretty good deal in that you have people who come and don't use a lot of services and yet spend their money and help our local businesses and local economy. That's the general overall theory. Whether that actually works or not, I don't know. It could be like the lottery, which was all supposed to go to education, and
Right.
who knows where that money goes.
But even beyond just the county money, is there any studies that the Airbnbs, you know, like how much they generate for, you know, economy to local economies, or how much?
I'm sure that, I mean, there must, just generally speaking, how much tourism would, I mean, we haven't.
And also the people that manage them and clean them and all that.
I don't have that much of myself. Well, I'm sure that Dutchess County Tourism must have a sense of what tourism brings into the local economy. I don't know that enough.
You could probably ask the county comptroller.
That's great.
I also want to get back to your second point about, you're right, there are sort of different types of short-term rentals. There are short-term rentals that, where the property owner lives on site as their primary residence, whether it's a single house on a lot. And sometimes they go out of town and rent it, or if you have a lot that has more than one building on it. Versus more of an investor owned short-term rental. And those definitely exist. I get random phone calls on occasion asking, for me to tell people, does such and such a town allow them? Are there regulations? And, my answer is generally, you'll have to just check in zoning, since I'm not gonna peck through 30 zoning codes to tell them where they're allowed and where they're not allowed, but that's definitely a thing. It's more of an issue in other places, if you go to real hot markets like New Orleans or New York City, or places around the world, it can be a huge issue. But that's not to say it's not a component of what you would want to consider here. And that's one of the things, like under sort of the overview of basic regulatory items. One of the things that I've got there, the third bullet down, is to think about is whether you want to require primary residency. That if you're gonna allow them, do you want to limit them only to lots where the owner lives on site for whatever you define being a primary resident is? Some people say it's more than half the year, some people say it has to be 9 months, you just have to figure it out.
Right, because like if they're here, then they go down south, and then they're trying to rent out,
Some folks actually look at, they say if you want to prove that it's your primary residence, you can show that you have the star exemption. Because in theory, you should only be getting the star exemption on residents in New York State.
So one thing that the town board told us, or when we discussed with the town board, they were saying perhaps not primary residence on site requirement, but like your primary residence in the town. So if you had one across town, that would be okay also. Is there any legal issues with that, or?
I don't think it's a legal issue. It maybe doesn't help you as much with your housing issue. Because if it's your house and it's your primary residence and you're offering it for short-term rental sometimes, or like it could be a room, right? You could say, I have a room and I'm offering a room for rent, or I'm going down to Florida for 3 months and I'm going to short-term rent my house while I'm out of town. It's not displacing anyone because it's still your primary residence. If you're a resident of the town, but you have a second property somewhere else in town, and then you're short-term renting that full time, then that is now off the table to be a long-term residence for someone else. Does that make sense?
It does.
It does.
But it also is restrictive of I think they're trying to balance,
Mhm.
like telling someone who's maybe even struggling to pay their taxes up here, stay here. And then they have a house across town, or another house, or their mother's house now they inherit, and instead of selling it, they're able to generates income off of it as an Airbnb, and then obviously this equals on site. There's a lot of accessory dwellings, like especially the Hamlet area, where they have a garage with the apartment over it, and is that a rental? And we've been trying to encourage that to become rental properties.
And that's what worries me, is that, we sit here and we talk, and is our goal as a town or a committee to limit the number of short-term rentals because it's affecting low-income housing here in Pine Plains, or is it to limit it because we don't believe that it's a good thing going on? They're bothering their neighbors, they're making too much money, and it's struggling. And there's got to be a constructive way to approach this where you limit it, but you also, in the same sense, encourage more housing for economical purposes. And then what scares me is I hear about the owner living on site, and that's what we've been trying to push here for the last zoning changes. And now we're saying that we can only do that for short-term rentals, and we're kind of pulling that away from that theory that we've already tried to progress here.
We're only doing what for short-term rental?
Well, we were talking about that owner occupied short-term rentals, right? With this, what we're just discussing.
Right.
So if it's only owner occupied, then does that encourage the people to put in more short-term rentals in rather than housing that would be affordable housing as rentals for the normal moderate person that lives and works here in the community?
As it relates to ADUs specifically.
Yes, sir.
So you can actually decide, right? And you could craft your regulations to say whether or not an accessory dwelling unit would be allowed to be a short-term rental. Because that is a distinction, you know? And actually, I'm glad you talked about goals, because the first item under my overview of basic regulatory items is to begin with a community conversation to figure out, because it really is important that you have these conversations and decide what is it that Pine Plains wants to do regarding short-term rentals. Because I can tell you, I went back through the codes that have been adopted in other communities in Dutchess County, and I sort of skimmed back through them today, and I mean, what a variety, you know, so many different ways of slicing and dicing short-term rentals. And a lot of it just has to do with every community is different. They are looking to do different things. They had different ideas on how to accomplish that. And I think what you're doing is great, sitting down and having the conversation and definitely figure that out first before you really start kind of nitpicking with what exactly would those regulations maybe look like. You really want to decide what are your overall.
Okay,
I do, my brother has one. But it is, like Janine said, my brother's mother-in-law comes from Germany. Ricky Butler comes and stays there every time he comes back. Marta Gill comes for a month from Spain. We have the inn, which is booked every day. There's nowhere to stay here. I think it benefits the community in that sense too. Maybe you also don't want someone living in your rental for that you can't get out, that trashes it, that, you know, it's just a different way to accomplish the same thing, make some money on your apartment or your dwelling. I also think it brings in a lot of work for people in the catering business, in the bartending, for weddings and all of the events that we have in the summer around here in the fall. Again, people are paid to clean them, you know, it does bring.
We also have, which we haven't really talked about, we have a lot of people have second homes here. And you brought to my attention that my neighbors have just listed their house. Well, they're second home owners and they don't come very much. And I think they should be able to rent out their place when they're not here. I just can't imagine not wanting to accommodate that so that it would help with the maintenance of this place that they can only be here in the summer or in the holidays or whatever.
so what's the delineation between them and someone who just has Airbnb and doesn't live here? So how do you, they would have to change their residency?
Well, they're not going to change their residency. It would make it impossible for them to rent their property.
They could rent it on a month-to-month basis through a realtor instead of using one of the apps, I guess, like the old-fashioned way, theoretically, would be the middle ground.
The other.
Well, they're not going to rent it month to month.
Only you're in that model, they would only rent it for a weekend or.
They would, and they have a manager who it's a company that they've listed it with that obviously take care of all of the details.
Mm-hmm.
So what some other communities have done is they will say, maybe they'll allow a non-primary resident to have a short-term rental, but they'll say you can have one permit or you can have two permits. And that's it. Now, I suppose it's, you know, if an investor really wanted to get around it and they would buy, you know, they could buy a bunch of properties with different company names and maybe you'd have a hard time figuring that out. But for the most part, it would allow, you know, that kind of an approach could allow for that type of situation if you have a lot of second homeowners who might be short-term renting in between their own stays. And this is what I mean, like you can sort of figure, you know, there's so many different ways to accommodate what it is that you would want to do. It is important to figure out those
Can I ask you, skimming through your looks at the other towns, would you say, when you say slice and dice, was most of what the other towns did to try to, let's say, limit, I don't like to use that word, was to put more regulations on, or was it to reward in another way of the zoning, in another way, which would be long-term rentals? Or have you seen any of that approach in the other towns?
I would say that the other codes, there are varying degrees of, some of them are relatively permissive, right? Some of them are pretty short and sweet, and they don't really address a whole lot. Some of them are very in-depth and complicated. Some are more limiting than others.
So for example, an ADU, someone goes to the planning board and says, I'm a full-time resident, I want to add an ADU, whether it's in the hamlet or outside of it. And they say, well, if you're willing to commit to keeping this on the open market for full-time rental housing, Pine Plains will offer you a 15% abatement for the first 5 years on your property tax.
Or it doesn't conform to the zoning right now through whether it's in the village or in the rural where it's density wise not enough, but we're gonna let you do it to add an ADU because we need more ADUs here, almost like some sort of approach. And because of that, we'll give you the 15%.
Whether or not, so I think you're allowed to have ADU as long as it's your primary residence. It's just that if it's a rental property, for example, one that you provide at market rate for normal rental terms, not short-term rentals, then you wouldn't be allowed to put up an ADU as our zoning is currently. That is to say that the incentive might only apply then when you're talking about to rental properties already are rental properties, not that are, okay, that's what you're saying. Gotcha.
So it is easy to start mixing accessory dwelling units and short-term rental considerations. And the thing that I would say is that you want to decide whether or not, if you're trying to encourage ADUs because you want more opportunities for housing in your community, I think that's great. If you're concerned that if you start encouraging more ADUs, but then they could become short-term rentals, you could just make sure that if you develop some short-term rental regulations, that you put a stipulation in there that an accessory dwelling is not eligible.
We'd like them to be eligible, I would think, especially if they're a primary residence attached, right? It's just that in a world where landlords could suddenly add ADUs everywhere, you'd like to see them, I think that's what you're saying, as permanent housing options rather than short-term rentals.
So you're saying where both units on a property have a landlord and are not being neither.
There's no owner living on site.
Okay.
I think that's what we're trying to do.
I have just maybe more of a comment than a question. I'm noticing that there are certain companies that become corporate that are buying up houses in these communities, Hudson Valley, the Catskills, Columbia County, Ulster County, and for one company is called redcottage.com. They rent through Airbnb, but they have 88 listings in the general region. How do you combat that? I mean, they may only have one or two in Pine Plains, but they have 86 others. And how, what sort of guidelines can you impose? I mean, I think in that case, it feels like the whole spirit of Airbnb no longer exists, where you used to be able to you might rent a room in your home or in above your garage apartment or something like that. But now they're coming in, they're buying up these homes and, nickel and diming the owner. I know of one case in particular on 199, it was very, I don't know, really not correct in a way that purported themselves to be a family with children and got the price way down. And now it's being run by redcottage.com. They've gutted the place. They've put in all these high-end units. and or not units, but high-end fixtures and furniture. It's really beautiful. But it's, to me, that's not the spirit of what Airbnb was supposed to be. And I would hate to see that sort of thing become really prevalent in complaints.
Yeah, I mean, Airbnb is definitely not what it started out as, right? It started out as a way to monetize like an available couch or an extra bedroom in like California rental market, where the housing prices were crazy. And it has now sort of come full circle, and it is its own beast, right? Off the top of my head, I'm not sure how you would block that, but also accommodate someone with a second, you know what I mean? With a second home, or somebody with a cottage on the property. And that's where you kind of have to figure out all of the goals and objectives of the community, and then start looking at, we don't sort of hold up one set of regulations and say, here's some model short-term rental regulations, because it really is, it needs to be community specific. But it is an education in the various ways that you can do things to actually look through and see what other communities are doing. Like I'm trying to think, the town of Poughkeepsie recently adopted regulations, and they're the first ones that have differentiated between a primary residence as short-term rental versus more of an investor-owned one, and so they treat that as commercial use, whereas they treat the other one as accessory to the residential use. They limit the number of permits that they'll give out for the commercial use one, and there really isn't a limit on any of those, whether it's hosted or unhosted, which I'm realizing I haven't talked about, but it isn't as important.
This is town of Poughkeepsie.
Town of Poughkeepsie, yeah. So, yeah, and that's sort of the more predatory investor piece of the puzzle that not everybody believes is going on, but it definitely is. It just may not be at the scale that other places that sort of end up with, New York Times articles are dealing with, but it's definitely there.
So what about that point is, I'm sorry, your name is?
Jean Valentine.
Jean brought up about, what about that investment in like rehabbing the housing stock, and that, because you might have like a broken down house that, that someone doesn't want to rent, and then they come in here and, fix it up and then rent it. And, is any thoughts on that? Like, helping to rehab it.
That is certainly held up as one of the potential benefits to short-term rentals, is that it can result in some homes getting, fixed up and improved.
Yeah, real benefits. Or, through my life, we know where they are. They've had a few slum landlords in town for years. Places were crap. And when somebody comes in and buys it, invests and put money in it and upgrade it, that's a big benefit to the community.
But to fix it up well is probably not to have it land as affordable housing. Market.
So I wanted to go bigger picture, and maybe this goes back to the chair and also to the town board. So if I'm trying to understand, and it goes to Heather talking about the community conversation, as I understand it, the town board has come to you as the chair of the standing committee and said, would you take a look at short-term rental? And when I hear that, I guess what I'm thinking that they're asking is, look at it, and are there problems that we can address? Is that basically what you?
Yeah, to look at they came to us with the one specific problem delineated, saying worrying about short-term housing. Then we asked them, is the issue of like parties or any of that sort of neighbor complaint sort of things? No, the one issue is the affordable
Okay.
The effect on affordability.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page with that.
And I think like after this meeting tonight, I think maybe we should have a public comment hearing thing to really bring the public in and get comments. And then once we gather this information, that information, maybe have one more meeting, then we can go back to the town board and say, this is what we found. What do you want? How do you want us to proceed?
Is the meeting about affordable housing, or is it about short-term rentals?
What is
the public?
about this?
meeting?
No, about this.
And
About short-term rentals,
Short-term rental.
yes.
It's definitely being spoken about around the town in various ways. There are people for it, people against it. But George Killer stood up before us and gave quite the speech about what's going on in Woodstock and people who are displaced that are artists and they can't afford, the higher prices that these short-term rentals are pushing up now because it's such a transient community where people want to come and visit and maybe climb some of the local mountains, see some art and some live music. And so, it seems to have pros and cons in both directions. So it really needs to be well thought out. It doesn't want to be something that is just thrown on the board really quick. And then all of a sudden you find out, well, we didn't really think that out very well because look at here are all these benefits that we just removed. So it's complicated. I think.
And I think that's the real thing is
Yeah.
what is our goal here? Are we trying to limit them? Because limiting them would be because there's too many loud noises or there's too many crazy parties. And that's not the problem here. The problem is that it's driving people out of their houses in our experience. And now the county's telling us there's much more other factors. And you look at the numbers at 2.6%, how much is that really doing? And is that going to make such a difference that it's actually going to help where this is going on in Woodstock per se? Is it going to help to solve the problem that we're trying to solve? Or should the efforts be dealt with somewhere with a town board of coming up with a good plan of what affordable housing is here in Pine Plains and try to figure that out?
are we adding more housing stock faster? Sorry, faster than we're adding short-term rental housing stock, for example, but that would be one metric. Which of those two zones is growing faster?
See, I think it's part of a bigger problem. It's affordable housing. It's not short-term rentals being necessarily the problem. I mean, I look at Red Hook and they did whatever that thing was, 160, 180 units at the old pie factory right in the middle of town. What are we doing here in Pine Plains? We have the Catholic Church lot. The Catholic Church has said they'd like to do affordable housing there. We haven't made any progress on the sewer. We could be doing great things right in the center of town, and we're not. We're doing nothing.
First I've heard of that.
I agree with Scott that there really are two separate issues, and I think before there's a hearing, I think that a lot of collection of data and statistics needs to happen.
Well, I think that's
We
part
need
of
to
the
know-
data though, what the public thinks.
I think it's part of it,
And the
but I
idea.
think that whether it's your board or the town board needs to be prepared with some statistics. How many short-term rentals do we have? We don't even know that right now. So that needs to be looked at. I mean, I kind of did a look and I found 40, but this says 50. So there they are. What size are they? How many bedrooms do they have? How many, and how would they compare to what would be an affordable long-term rental? I think we need to have a little bit more information ready in order to have a public hearing. Because right now, I think that there are way too many more questions than answers. So I think that some of the statistics need to be in place. I would only feel comfortable, having people respond to this if we have some of the statistics, some of the facts.
But I don't think he was suggesting a public hearing because we were about to pass a law.
No,
Public hearing to say, what does the town want? Where do we
Exactly.
stand? What are your
Right.
I think
thoughts?
we need to be able to present to the town, this is what exists. And what are your
Right,
thoughts
but
about that? I don't think we can just say, well, what do you think about the color orange? We need to say, we have to have some facts in place. So
Question along those lines. If there are 2.6% is higher than the Dutchess County average. Do you know where we are in terms of percentages in towns in Dutchess County? Like, are we one of the towns with the most short-term rental?
So 2.6%,
Yeah,
is that high or low for county average, I guess?
well, it says right there,
Three times
county
higher
average
than
is
that.
8%, 0.8%.
right. So
Okay,
the county has just over 1,000 short-term rental units that we know of. And based on, the percentage of our overall number of housing units is 0.8%.
okay.
0.8%
I
of the
didn't see
housing
that.
units in Dutchess County are short-term rentals. In Pine Plains, it's 2.6%. So Pine Plains has sort of 3 times the percentage of short-term rental units.
I'd like to see that compared to the number of second homes, because that's kind of what we are here.
Mhm.
A lot of people from New York have second homes here. So how does that relate to that? You know, are we prone to that because of the kind of community that we are?
True.
That's a great point.
Yep.
You know,
And then
I bet there's a lot more second homes here than there are short-term
And in the
rentals.
rest of Dutchess County.
Bam. So,
And I know we
Wow.
think that there aren't a lot of rentals, but when, from walking to my house to town, there are a lot of actual rentals.
Yeah.
Like, it'd be interesting to know just in the hamlet, how many are rentals and not
That's
homes.
another reasonable question.
There are
Yeah, I think we need
I
to
would
know
think
that before we
mostly,
enter into the discussion.
Short-term rentals would be affordable rentals.
I agree
But
with
that-
all that.
What's that?
Most of the houses that are short-term rentals, I don't think would be affordable rentals if they weren't short-term rentals.
We'll study.
I kind of agree with that too.
Well, that's.
Well, I also think like, you know, some of the things we're talking about, would relate to how we're thinking about short-term rentals and what laws or suggestions so that we would make to the town board or how we would want to progress. But I also think it would be kind of good to know what the, like, come up with a short questionnaire about this topic in particular, you know, has any neighborhood people have complaints? Because we've not heard any, but that doesn't mean there are none, right? And you get a broader census when you start asking those questions of what the real problems are out there in the same sense too. And then you can focus in on what you're trying to accomplish and what your goals are and how to get there.
if you could ask at the same time to asking that question, you know, what are the things that are stopping you from adding an accessory dwelling unit on your property, whether it's in the hamlet or just outside of it, for example? I'd be curious to know what stops people from doing it. That the town could collectively clear the way a little bit for that activity, whether or not it's for a place, an ADU where someone lives full time, or if the town changes their zoning to allow ADUs on rental properties as well. But you know, if there was an off the shelf plan for a 1 bedroom and a 2 bedroom that our building inspector already felt good about, that the town was paying, like you could get some grant money to hire an architect and say, here's an off the shelf plan that the town is comfortable with. Maybe people might say, oh, once they knew the path was easy to add an ADU, they might be on board to add one, for example. But there might be other questions adjacent on creating affordable housing that you could ask at the same time to that question.
One thing I just want to throw out there is, when you're thinking about, are we gonna regulate short-term rentals? If we do, how are we gonna regulate them? We do a little bit, we do a lot. One thing to keep in mind is, even if you don't really feel like it's a problem now, you don't know how many redcottage.coms there might be coming down the road, so you could always craft it to sort of kind of accommodate what you have and maybe with a little bit of wiggle room. But if you don't adopt something, then you sort of open the doors to the whims of whoever wants to come in and do this. So it's just one way to frame it in your mind. You know, do you want to kind of put some barriers up?
I think we want to discourage the purchase of investor units. It would seem to me that that's what you really would like to limit.
Yes.
Especially after a lot of the zombie houses have already been purchased and rehabilitated. But so it's not just a question of if.
No, I was
but
gonna
when.
say, with
But
the,
when do you want to apply those regulations?
with the proviso that what if there is one of those really ugly ones? I would love to have somebody come in and, you know, when I think of how Frank Perotti kept those houses for all those years. Falling down and in horrible shape.
I'm sorry about this conversation specifically
Uh-huh,
because of one of those houses.
uh-huh.
Even both of them that haven't been entirely prepared. I'm not sure what the gentleman, it seems like a great guy. Everyone seems to regard him well, who bought them. But if he finds out, you know, that his ability to
Well, he would be grandfather.
Well, that was my other
earn on his
question.
investment, you know, he might be saying, okay, well, I'm not gonna put the $500,000 into this house now. I'm gonna.
Yeah, and I know that Heather's not an attorney unless she's gone to law school since I worked with her. But it seems like that houses that have already been converted and are being used as short-term rentals, can we retroactively go back and take that away from them? Wouldn't they be grandfathered in?
Yeah,